Hey, can everybody hear me this evening? We've had problems with that in the past, so hopefully you can all hear. I'll start by saying thank you for joining us today at this, the third in our series of community workshops to discuss the impact of declining enrollment on our current RSD 13 facilities. We're joined today by several members of our Board of Education. I've seen Norm Hicks and Bob Fulton, and I saw Merrill Adams, and I can't see enough to, oh, there's Victor. Good to see you, Victor. So thank you very much for the Board of Ed members who are here. We also have with us tonight Dr. Catherine Veronese, our new superintendent of schools, sitting over there. Welcome. And we have our consultants from Drummond, Rosane, and Anderson, headed up by Jim Barrett, who I'll introduce in a moment. For those of you who may be joining us for the first time tonight, I'd like to state the objectives of the facility study and update you on our findings to date. After years of a slow but steady decline in student enrollment, the board hired DRA to fulfill three primary objectives. The first was to update and corroborate the findings of an initial demographics study that was conducted in the spring of 2012. The second was to assess the condition and configuration of our current school facilities. And the third is to present a variety of options which will allow the district to optimize our space utilization and to gain an understanding of the relative cost benefits associated with each of these options. What we have seen thus far is that the physical space needed to accommodate the integrated day program and the contemporary program is the same. And what I mean by that is that in terms of physical space, an ID classroom is exactly the same size as a contemporary classroom. In fact, the options previously presented, as well as those presented tonight, accommodate our projected student enrollments regardless of the way in which we proceed with our educational programming. Another insight illuminated during our review of these options is that by reducing the number of elementary schools, we will also reduce the number of student transitions for our elementary school students. Remember that currently, from the first grade on, some of our students are moving to new buildings as often as once every 2 years until they get to high school. We have an opportunity to reduce those student transitions. One thing these options have confirmed is that how we employ our facilities does not have a direct impact on our decisions with respect to educational programming. Accordingly, DRA will not be making a recommendation that affects our choice program. The options they present will address how we use our facilities, not how we choose to educate our children. And with that being said, I'd like to introduce Jim Barrett of Drummond, Rosane, and Anderson to begin tonight's workshop and to explore their findings in greater detail. Jim?
Good evening. I'd like to say also thank you for coming out and joining us this evening. Tonight's presentation is broken into two segments. The first segment will focus on demographics and enrollment information. The second component will focus on options and alternatives responsive to those questions that Carrie has posed behind me relative to the utilization of the school facilities here in RSD 13. Joining me this evening from Mylone and McBroom a team that has focused on looking at enrollment projections and studying demographic trends here for this community. Ali Church, who has been with us at past workshops. Many of you might recognize her. And also Michael Zuba, again from my Loan and the Crew. And also with me this evening is Paul Moore, our program planner from USA Anderson. The first portion of our presentation will be that of the enrollment projections. So I will turn it over to Ali and Michael at this point and let them take us through that component of the study effort. Again, thanks for coming.
Thanks, Jim. I think what we're going to start with tonight, I know a lot of you have been at the numerous workshops we've had and were able to engage in discussion with Ali regarding the housing demographics as well as some of the economic conditions. We're going to touch on that, but really focus on some of the enrollment history and the enrollment projections that we've recently updated. At this time, I'll turn it over to Ali to take us through the demographic overview.
Great, thanks, Mike. So again, this will be a little bit of an overview for people who've already seen my spiel for 3 times now. But just looking at the 2 towns overall, we like to start our enrollment projections not just with the students, but of course what's going on in the towns and how the general population and economic trends will influence the enrollment projections later on. And so here we just see some quick overviews of things that we've looked at. Population density, where people are living in the town. Clearly it's centered around the 2 villages. The chart on the right is interesting because both towns have slightly growing population. That's since the 1960s, but it's continued. Middlefield pretty stable, but still slightly growing. When we look, though, at each age cohort, this is when we start to see things that can really affect school projections. So these trees, as we call them, population trees that you're looking at here, the left side are women, the right side are men, and each bar going up and down is a 5-year age group. And so what you see on the left is 2000, what the population makeup looked at like in 2000, and then what it looked like in 2010. And so both of them have the largest age groups are wage earners and then their children, which is pretty standard. But what we see moving from left to right, so moving over the 10 years of the US Census data from 2000 to 2010, is that you're losing population in some really key areas. The most bottom line, which is the under 5-year-olds. The one just above that, the 5 to 9-year-olds, you're losing population there. And where you're gaining is your 45 to 59, and that kind of bubble is moving upwards. And so even though the overall population is growing, you're losing those potential future students. And then, of course, we also look at the births and how this is affecting it. So we know that the census confirms that we're losing under 5-year-olds, but what do the birth numbers tell? We get what's called live birth data from the Connecticut Department of Health. Every time a birth is registered to a mother who claims residency in one of the 2 towns, we've obtained a record of that. And what we see is that from about 1996 to the high in 2004 there is you were averaging above 120 births a year. And then it's been steadily declining, and last year there were 66 births. So we're looking at almost half of the amount of births. And just for a point of reference, how do births affect enrollments, the 2008 that you see there, the number is 92 for Region 13. Just to clarify, we get the data for the 2 towns, so the bottom line is Middlefield, the top line is, or the middle line is Durham, and then we just summed them, added them together to get what we're calling the Regional School District 13 number. And so if you look at that RSD 13 number for 2008, that's 92 births. And that's this year's incoming kindergartners, where we had 89 incoming kindergarten students. So this decline that we're seeing in births hasn't yet come through our kindergarten classes. That 66, that really low birth year, won't happen until 2017. And we do see, as you can tell from this sum, a little bit of recovery. We think that 66 was an exceptionally low year, but we're still not looking at numbers that are 120, 130, as we saw in the recent past. How do we take that forward and kind of predict what will happen beyond those numbers? One thing that we do have, the Connecticut Data Center at UConn does population projections by 5-year age group. And so you see those here. Durham is on top, Middlefield is on the bottom. You see the historic ones we have, 2000, 2010, and then 3 years of projections. And what we're really seeing is between 2010 and 2020, in most of those years, there are declines. And then some picking up later on in 2025. But again, a woman who has a child in 2025, at the minimum, that child won't come into the system until 2030. So if there are some upward trends, we're looking many years out. So we take those women and we apply a birth rate to them, and this is how we've gone through our birth projections, a fertility rate to them, I'm sorry. And there's, again, 2 sets of fertility rates that we can use. Connecticut does a statewide fertility rate, and then for the United States, we can get fertility rates by race. And so we look at how the composition of a community works and which that fits better. And here, you can see we use both of those fertility rates. We also just did an average. We said, well, what happened in the last 5 years? If that continues forward, what will that be? And what we came out with was we decided to use the U.S. fertility rate for non-Hispanic whites. We felt that reflected the demographics of the school district. It also, although 2015 is lower than our mathematical projection, it recovers better in 2020 and 2025, which we think will, or I guess in 2025, which is not on here, but we felt that was more accurate. So this one dips, when we put them line by line, this one dips a little lower, but it recovers better. And so what you see is then from there we extrapolated out the years, and we've predicted births to do the end of our enrollment projections. Just a quick summary in case you're not hearing me talk and someone's reading this online later, so I'll just breeze through that. But just a general comment, Region 13 is certainly not alone. What you see on the right is the Connecticut public school enrollment statewide. We're down 20,000 students in 7 years, so again, it's not just here. And then on the left, I think something that often comes up is, well, we have the echo boom coming through, or the echo boom, I'm not sure which we're on yet. But overall, nationally, and this chart on the left goes from 1909 to 2009, that orange bit in the middle is what we consider the baby boom. So even as the echo boom, which you can see kind of peaked in 1989 there, the birth rates are way down from this idea. We're not having the baby boom come back. Their kids aren't coming, their grandkids aren't coming. They are, but they're not, it's just not the same ballpark of numbers. So again, returning to looking specifically at the 2 towns, we also, of course, looked at things like economic and housing data. This is just an example of housing data. What we've done is stacked the total housing units from the state. Durham is in blue, Middlefield is on orange. And they've been growing. There was a slight dip after 2010, but generally on an upward trend. But what we matched with that is the number of students per unit, and that's been declining. So we're now at about 0.45 students per housing unit. So even though houses may be getting built, and you see them getting built, we're actually having less students living in them. And this is confirmed, this is housing permits. Just note that for the next 2 slides, 2013, we don't have December data, so it's January through November. The rest of the years have 12 months. And we are up from last year, up from the last couple of years, but we're not up at that 84 number, and we're not even up to, slightly pre-recession, 2006. You were having 42 housing permits a year, and again, last year was about 18. And housing sales is a similar thing. We actually had slightly lower numbers in 2013. We'll should really wait for the last month to know what went on there. But even if we look at an average in the last 5 years of around 90, we're still not at the levels of 160. So we don't have huge amounts of people moving in, buying houses. Houses aren't turning over the same way that they were 5 or 10 years ago. And I'm going to pass it off to Mike now to actually get into what this means for students' enrollments.
Thanks, Allie. What we rely on for developing enrollment projections for all school systems is the cohort survival methodology, which is predicated on the past being a good indication of the near future. And what this relies on is looking at the historic data from year to year over a number of years and the progression of students through the system. It takes into account through persistency ratios all of the demographic, economic, and housing data that Allie had discussed. These are all the external factors. They help explain when you have a boom in housing, why you may have a boom of children show up as you guys experienced in the early part of the 2000s, as well as looking at when there's a change in economic conditions, you will see an abrupt change in your student enrollment. One of the things that Connecticut is experiencing as a whole is it's not only been the decline throughout Connecticut and really the nation, but it's become a very difficult time for school facility planning in general when you're wondering in what direction is the national economy going to rebound after the Great Recession has passed or hasn't passed. Really the question bears is what is the new normal for economic conditions. Taking a look at the recent historic enrollment, we highlighted in green why your enrollment projections haven't fallen off as far as you would think it has over the last 10 years. You have a rather large number of students in your existing middle school as well as high school. I think we can focus on this year's current 13 and 14 enrollments and look at your 5th, 6th, and 7th grade class sizes and see that you're looking at about 170, 160, and 180 students there in 5, 6, and 7. And you look to the left across the chart and you realize that, well, what's going to replace those students in the near future are these much smaller class cohorts of 126, 139, 112. And you look back now a decade to the top of the chart, looking at 2001, and you can see that across the board you had great cohorts that were in the mid to high 100s across the board. Now realizing that as we progress forward and these students matriculate through the system, there is a much more significant pronounced loss, as you all are aware, of students opting into private high schools between 8th and 9th grade. But this is why, as we get into the enrollment projections, it partially helps explain why the middle school and high school are going to begin experiencing a rather steep decline. Looking at the persistency ratios, I think I highlighted a couple key facts. When we begin building our projections, we ran through numerous models to see which model best fits the region. And what we found was that the conditions today, as in particular with respect to the birth decay, looking at the birth decay being slightly below 1, showing that you're having a loss of students that from those that were born 5 years ago. And if you look along the left-hand side of the chart, you can see the birth decay in the early part of the 2000s was much higher than 1. So you were having about a 25 to 30% increase over the number of births and that would show up 5 years later in the system. Those are indicative of a strong economy, a strong housing market, where you had a lot of starts, you had a lot of sales. So people who weren't there 5 years ago, or birth that wasn't there 5 years ago, somebody moved within that 5 years with a child that was ready for school age at some point in time. Another key fact I'd like to point out is looking at the 8 to 9 persistency ratio, where it's about 85%, 84, 85%. That shows a loss of 8th graders that would opt into another high school option rather than going to Cog and Chog. And I think when you take a look at the smaller class sizes that are moving through and realizing that you're losing students throughout the experience, that in part feeds into the decline that we're seeing here. I'm looking at it over the next decade. We're looking at about a 30% decline for the entire system. Annualized, it's about 70 to 80 for every year, but it's not spread out evenly amongst all of the grades. We're going to touch on that in a minute, but what I wanted to touch on with the group tonight is the assumptions. If these assumptions, all projections are based on assumptions, especially when you get out past 5 years. When you get out past 5 years, you no longer have known births. You still have students in seats, which is very important, but you're taking a guess, especially at the elementary level. What are the economic conditions? What are the housing conditions going to be? How is that going to drive the incoming kindergartners? And what we're looking at going forward over the next decade is the assumption that births are going to range between 75 and 110. So it's a slight uptick from the 66 and the 72 that Ally had discussed prior, as well as looking at an unemployment rate to stay between 6 and 7%. That unemployment rate has rebounded over the last year, so we're looking at holding that steady. Looking at annual housing sales to be right about where they've ended the last 2 years, between 90 and 120 annually, and housing starts are still going to remain on the low side of things, between 7 and 20 annually per year for the horizon of these projections. I'd like to touch on the picture that this paints, and I think taking a look at the dark blue color on the bottom of the stacked bar chart indicates your pre-K4 enrollment throughout the system, and you can see that the decline there, you start all the way on the left looking at the 2001, has already experienced a lot of that. You've already felt a lot of that, but you can see that there was some stability overall in the upper grades. Now we're moving on past the diagonal line to the lighter blue and seeing that that started flattening out. Well, that is your elementary enrollment beginning to hit the trough, beginning to hit the bottom and flattening out. But while that's happening, you're beginning to see the other grade levels, the 5, 6, now beginning to decline in the compression. That doesn't begin to flatten until the latter half of the 10-year horizon. But where it's really getting compounded is getting into 7th and 8th and in the high school, where those enrollments were fairly static throughout. Now they're going to begin experiencing the decline as those smaller grade class sizes begin matriculating through and you lose those larger grade cohorts that we had discussed earlier. I'm taking a look at our district-wide projections over the next 10 years. We're going to break it up into 2 separate windows. We're looking at a fairly large decrease overall. However, when you begin to look at the individual components, it paints a much different picture. Over the next 5 years, your elementary school is projected to decline an additional 20% from where you're at today. However, there will be a flattening over that for the second 5 years. Looking at the 5 through 8 grouping paints a little bit of a different picture. Now we're looking at a decline that's going to be about 20% overall for both of those given years. What that is telling us is that it's not only being fed by the smaller class sizes that we had highlighted in yellow, but also looking at the births and looking at those grade cohorts as they begin moving through, that the next 10 years are going to have much smaller grade cohorts there throughout the 5 through 8. And then we begin looking at the high school, realizing that the first 5 years we're having this much smaller decline of about 7.5%, 8% overall. The back half of that, where we're going to experience the main part of the decline, is when these much smaller class sizes are now gone and we've lost those much larger class sizes. I'm looking at the 2 elementary schools. They're both projected to lose about 22, 21, 22% over the next 5 years. However, over the last 5 years of this 10-year projection window, there's going to be a great flattening there. It's clear that you've reached the bottom. And I think Ally mentioned earlier the long-term picture, looking at the females of childbearing age paired with the fertility rates, is that in the year 2020, 2025 is when you're going to begin seeing the rebound of the births, and coinciding with that should also be the stabilization and the ultimate rebound of the elementary population. Overall, the projection summary is based on a lot of assumptions. What we do know is that over the next 5 years, we know the births for the elementary system. We have a fairly good handle on the economic conditions, realizing that even though the decline has been gradual, so will the rebound be gradual. Looking at enrollment trends, I think what's key is when you begin to look back at the national trend that Ally had up on for fertility rates, in that there was a series of peaks and valleys. Everything runs in cycles. And that's what we're going to see in the enrollment projections here, in that when the elementary enrollment begins to flatten, the middle school enrollment and the high school enrollment will really begin to feel the crunch of the decline at that time. As the larger grade cohorts progress through, the smaller grade cohorts will be replacing them. I don't think it's any one individual factor that is contributing to the decline here. I think it's numerous factors. Some of those stem from the great economic conditions we had in the early part of 2000s, when we saw a lot of stability in the system and a lot of growth there. When we looked at the immigration rates, there was a lot of people moving in with school-age children. Now those are moving through. It's stagnant economic times. That's what's really starting to feed it, as well as the larger national birth trends that everyone is experiencing and the downturn in the economy that we're all struggling to overcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali and Michael. For those of you who may have questions, we will have a question and answer period at the end of this portion of the presentation, where we can focus on issues and concerns that you may have. What Paul and I would like to do at this point is focus a bit on the utilization study. The space utilization study, as was laid out at the outset, is really looking at the existing conditions. It looks at issues relative to how the schools are currently used today, finding those things that are part of RSD 13 that we know we would absolutely never want to change, and recognize those areas of constraint, areas where we know there are possibilities for improvement. These are the 6 buildings that were made part of the study. The building that we're in this evening, a great facility here at the high school. But in terms of the elementary schools, as Michael had just touched on, the Lyman, the Brewster, and the Corn, at the middle school level, the Memorial, and the Strong, making up the facilities that we had a look at. As was just touched on, one of the key drivers is that of declining enrollments, and what does that mean in terms of the capacities of the various facilities within the district. In terms of our approach, it's approaching about a year now since we've begun our work here within your community. And in terms of the types of activities, we see it as a series of building blocks, if you will. The acts of collecting, listening, visioning, and then ultimately documentation in form of a space utilization study. So when we talk about collecting the first of these building blocks, it's really taking information like that, which Ali and Michael had just shared, information about who are the users of these facilities. Also, in terms of collection, we've had opportunity with a team of architects and engineers, including mechanical, electrical, plumbing, fire protection, structural, come through and take a look at each of these facilities. And that will be made part of our efforts here.
The listening portion of this is my favorite portion. It's a chance to get to sit down with the people that are involved with the schools, administrators, teachers, custodians, all the different elements of the school, find out how it operates in this particular district, and where there may be opportunities and problems. So it's a listening for people to help understand the way things currently are, and also look forward to see what can happen. We get into visioning, which is the next step, and part of that is these kinds of meetings where the whole community comes together and tries to figure out, okay, if this is the situation, these are the existing conditions and these are the projections, what sort of things do we want to do with that? You know, is that an opportunity? Is that a problem? How do we resolve this? And so the visioning part is where we look forward and say, here's some options. We like to generate the widest possible range of options so that we leave no stone unturned. And we're able to find usually from the two extremes. One extreme is not doing anything, just continuing the way things are, and the other extreme is replacing them with completely new buildings. Well, someplace in between those extremes, there are some very interesting options. That's what we're going to present tonight as we go forward.
The last of these building blocks that we're touching on is that of documentation. And the utilization study document ultimately will be presented to the Board of Education. Within it, it's not the idea of producing a single recommendation, but rather several recommendations. Purpose of this meeting is not to demonstrate a single recommendation, but to continue our process in terms of coming to understand advantages and disadvantages of a variety of options and alternatives, and bring them down to a handful, which then we would bring forward to the Board of Education. As Paul said, what we try to develop are a range of families of options. And starting at the top of this chart, that idea of do nothing. What if we simply kept the system as it stands today? And many within the community might think, isn't that the least expensive approach? Typically, as we come to understand it, it's not as inexpensive as some may begin to think initially. These holdings represent the single largest grouping of holdings within the district. These types of facilities are the most expensive to maintain, just based on sheer square footage involved. So it's a very significant consideration in terms of utilization. What is the appropriate utilization of these structures? The second family option that we're exploring is that of B in the listing behind me, and that's to maintain all the schools, possibly retire those areas like portables where we can either demolish or retire them and have them out of the system and reduce that square footage, but look to maintain the buildings in a more proactive stance, rather than a do-nothing stance, which is basically reactionary. Put into a proactive stance where you're trying to group together those needed repairs and ongoing maintenance, such that you're not penalized as these various things come to the table in terms of need of repair, need of replacement, or end of useful life expectancy. The third family that we explored was that of family options C, and that's to begin to question, what if closure of a building or buildings is considered? What might be the outcome? What might be some of the better options or alternatives relative to selection in terms of what buildings should remain as part of the holdings of Regional School District 13? And lastly, option family D, looking at that other end of the spectrum that Paul just touched on. What if we replaced all the buildings with new structures? And this is one of those that kind of brackets things. It's outside the expectation of what is reasonable, but it certainly gives us a good reference point, because as you're considering investment in an existing building, often a question that is asked is, well, how does that compare to replacement? So that's something that we wanted to be able to compare and contrast a variety of options and alternatives relative to. This diagram is one, and it's one of a series of tools that we utilize in terms of coming to understand how do these various options and alternatives compare and contrast as they look against a series of considerations. So across the top of this matrix, and they're color-coded by family option groups. So the one to your left is that of family option A, and that's that consideration of what if we did nothing? And that's located in this column. The second in yellow is that of family option B. What if we maintained the buildings, did some demolition of space that might be not up to standard or underutilized, but did it in a proactive stance. The grouping in green is that of family option C. What if consideration of closure of a facility or facilities was taken under consideration, and what might they look like? And then last column up here to your right is that of family option D. What if we considered new structures?
Jim, can you make that any larger for those that have out here?
Zero
Let me come back to that in one moment, if I may. I will do it. I think I have a way that I can do it more simply here. 1 second. Does that help? We have a mix of yes and no's? More yeses, okay. Good point, thank you, Carrie. If you're having difficulty seeing, I feel like the priest in my parish. Come on down. There are seats available here within the first 3 rows, and by all means, you won't disturb us in terms of movement in the audience. So please come on down if you are having difficulty reading this. Let me roll back. As I was saying, color-coded along this top portion of the matrix. The gray color coding is that of the do nothing option, option A. The one in yellow is that of option family B. What if we maintained all of the facilities, yet in a proactive stance, began to look at maintenance schedules for them? The green grouping is a family option where consideration of closure of a building or buildings would be considered. And then the blue column off to your right, that of the consideration of family option D, what if new buildings were considered? Down the left-hand column of this matrix is that of the considerations, and the top block, which is within this grouping, is that of consideration of cost. And we use a relative scale of costs here, and the lower numbers are those of least advantageous considerations. A higher number assignment is that of most advantageous. So it gives us the opportunity of an issue like the third row down, net cost RSD 13, to compare across all of the various considered family options, how it might compare and contrast. Similarly, we then could look vertically down a column and tab what's the overall performance of that particular option relative to all the considerations. Let me scroll down in the considerations. Issues of construction issues would be one that would be brought into consideration as we look at these. How technology upgrades might be either easily or less easily made part of an approach. How phasing might be considered as part of a various family option. Scrolling down, educational outcomes, educational results, program fit. Looking at that question of utilization, how well does the need, number of students, marry with the size of facility being given? Looking at issues of flexibility. How well does the building address issues of need relative to flexibility in terms of types and styles of educational spaces that are needed to meet today's educational needs, and also looking forward. This utilization study was one that was meant to look forward 10 to 15 years. Moving down to project results, these are things that might be considered more at a community-wide basis, things like community improvements. Resources like this auditorium be made part of the overall consideration. Safety, are there opportunities relative to issues like pedestrian and vehicular circulation or amount of traffic that's being brought to a site based on utilization? those are things that might be thought about. The last on this listing was that of accessibility. How easily might a building be brought up to code and standard relative to accessibility issues? Issues like the Americans with Disabilities Act. So those were some of the considerations. As we looked at these vertical tabs coming down the columns, we end up with overall raw scores at the bottom. And again, what I'd like to stress in this is, this isn't magic in any sense. It's a tool that we utilize, and it's one that helps us shape considerations. As we look across the bottom, highest score, most advantageous relative to these considerations, is that found in the blue column, and you'll recall the blue column represented new construction. Well, we also offered at the outset it's likely the one that's least likely to be able to be afforded or least likely to be able to be seriously pursued. Why would it garner such a high score? And it really speaks to, this is not a weighted score in any way. We simply took the considerations, scored them as we would see them, but certainly we have to apply all other considerations, and certainly cost and ability to do so is a significant one. So although it scored high, it really would not be a significant consideration to think about replacing all of the structures here within RSD 13. Some of the higher values that we were able to identify were found through the grouping, which began to look at options where closure of a building or buildings might be considered. So that's an area where we did see some scores come in well in terms of responding to the various considerations. And we'll talk more about that as we kind of highlight them and bring them forward in looking at the specifics of those options that we feel offer some benefit in terms of further consideration by the Board of Education. I'll go to this next slide back again, and this is at the scale which is going to be difficult at the back of the room, and it's that idea of what were those options that we felt might be able to be considered for additional consideration. And really, option C1 was one. This speaks about closing a school and reconfiguring the grade configuration as it currently stands. Another that we looked at was option C3. And option C3 looks at closing 2 schools, but we recognized in this that the remainder of the facilities in the system would not be able to fully support the numbers of students. There would have to be an addition associated with this option, and grade reconfiguration would be considered as well. And then lastly, 2 that are actually grouped, and they're the C4s. We have them listed as C4 and C4.1. Each of these looks at closing the school and taking another school and repurposing it as an early childhood center. This family option also looks at the idea of reconfiguration of the system. At this point, Paul's going to touch a little bit on each of these in more detail. One thing that we'd like to start with is in terms of option A, which is identified as the do-nothing option, to identify the configuration as it stands today. Paul, do you want to touch a bit on this?
Okay. I want to just describe a little bit what this graphic represents. Across the top are a list of grades, starting with pre-K and going all the way up to 12. And those grades are housed in the different buildings. Each of these bubbles here represents a building. They each have a different color. So the Brewster is the red one. The Lyman School is the green. The Court School is the purple. Memorial School is the teal color. Strong School has gray. And the high school has the sort of maroon color. And these colors are consistent all the way through the rest of the presentation, the various options. Each of these schools has a capacity that's been calculated based upon the number of teaching spaces that are in there, and using the Board of Ed standards for classroom loading. And that capacity is also compared with the number of students that are going to be enrolled in the schools. I want to speak a little bit about which year we're looking at here, because it changes from year to year. Generally, it's going to be going down over time. So what is the worst case scenario? The worst case scenario would be like this year. You know, we have more students now than we're going to have next year, and so on. It keeps going down. But we can't implement any of these right away. Probably not even next year, because the budget is already set, and so forth. So we took a look at 2016 as the earliest possible moment when something could be implemented. And so we've taken that as a kind of a snapshot and say, okay, let's look at that year and see how many students we have at each grade, at each building, and how many classrooms will be available. When I calculate the capacity of the school, it depends very much on which grades it's serving. So a classroom that's serving kindergartners, 18 students, is very different than a classroom, could be the same classroom, that's serving, say, 4th grade with 22 students. So the capacity of the buildings changes as different grades are reorganized into them. Let's go to the bar graph. This is a visualization of capacity versus enrollment for this option here. This is in 2016, and you can see the white space on those bars. That's the excess capacity above the enrollment for that particular year, broken out school by school. And down at the bottom, there's a white number that's, I'm sorry, that's very hard to see. But I just want to read that for you. In the Brewster School, this is in 2016, that would be a 69% occupancy. In the Corn School, it's 78%. In the Lyman School, it's 79%. In the Memorial School, it's 63%. The Strong School, which is the grades 7 and 8, it's 57%. And in the Caucasian High School, it's 77%. Let's go forward to 2023, just so you see what happens if you continue with the same configuration. Yes. The portables are still in play in this option here. Yes, that's true. And in this one, you can see the dotted lines there. Those are for reference. Those show what the enrollment number was in 2016. This is in 2023, and you can see that the elementary schools have a little bit of a drop, but they're pretty much reaching their bottom out. But the real change happens when you move up in grades to the Memorial, the Strong, and the high school. You can see the amount of additional available space that's in those buildings. So this really says to us, okay, how do we take advantage of this, or what opportunities are there as we go forward? And that would be, the range of the study from the 2016 option going all the way down to 2023. Just wanted to give you sort of a scope of the kind of changes that are coming. Okay, so let's go to option C1. In option C1, the biggest change here, I just want to make it easy for people to sort of categorize this. This is the closing of the Corn School, all right? And reconfiguring of the grades. So let me just walk through the grades here. The red bar is the Brewster School, and it is now serving pre-K through 3, pre-K up to grade 3. And the Lyman School is serving grades K through 3. The enrollment capacity versus enrollment is in the bar chart down below, and you can see that the Brewster is at 85%, and the Lyman is at 66%. of capacity. The Memorial School is serving the next 2 grades, 4 and 5. Okay, so what I've done is taken the middle school, which was really being underutilized, and made it a 3-grade middle school. This is a very advantageous reconfiguration of grades for the middle school group. 3 grades in middle school is a very common configuration, and it really matches up also with the core testing configurations that's coming up as well, because we used to have the 4th and 6th in the same building, but they were actually covered by 2 different sets of tests. So this helps to reconfigure it this way. So the strong school takes 3 grades now, 6, 7, and 8, and that configuration helps to fill the school better. So that's up to 76%. And the Memorial School is taking grades 4 and 5, so they're at 61%. The order in which this would happen is first you would move the 6th grade to the strong middle school. Next you would move all the 4th grades into the Memorial School. Classrooms would no longer be used at the Lyman modular classrooms. They would not be necessary in this option. They could be taken out of the operation. Corn would the 3rd grade from Corn would move to the Brewster, and then the Corn would be empty and could be closed. Yes, the portables are taken out. So the number of classrooms that are available in the Lyman School are 11 classrooms without the portables, and that's what's shown on this diagram. Okay. Now, option C3, this is where we attempt to close two buildings. The 2 that are closed here are the Corn and the Lyman. We would move the 6th grade to the strong middle school, so we still have the 3-grade middle school. We would add 7 classrooms to Brewster in order to make this work. And I think that's kind of a big negative here, because you're building almost the equivalent in space of the Corn School at the Brewster site in order to accommodate this kind of a thing. You would split the 5th grade between the Brewster and the Memorial, move all the Lyman to the Memorial, that's grades K to 4, move all the Corn to Brewster, that's grades 3 and 4, and close both the Lyman and the Corn School. And by doing this exercise, I think it tells us that although we have a severe drop in numbers, at least in 2016, it would not be possible to close 2 schools. It would not be a practical way of doing it. So that's option C3.
Before we move on, what we can share is the bar chart that we identified on the first slide. It does show as part of option C3, again, with closure of Lyman and Corn. As Paul indicated, this would require an addition of space, and it's shown with this dashed box line here, which is additive space to the Brewster School. But ultimately, RSD 13 would then reside as a 4-school regional school system, with the Brewster, Memorial, Strong, and the high school as part of it. Utilization rates improve in terms of the capacities at each of the schools, but each of them still has the flexibility of additional students in the future, so it has that cushion built within the approach.
Yeah, I want to say we're not shooting for 100% utilization of every single seat in every school as an ideal planning target. Yes, sir. No, this is still the 2016. For 2023, the numbers would be lower. So but you'd have to wait a long time for that to happen.
And there's no error measurements in there for the projection or interference with that as well.
Well, you can see because they're not filling up the buildings,
Right.
they would have the flexibility to be able to accommodate normal variances.
If we can ask, typically we like to take questions as they come so that we can respond immediately. But given the nature of this format, we'd ask if we could hold questions until the end. And when we do have questions, if you can take a microphone so everybody can hear your question, I think it might be the best way for us to have everybody hear the question and hear the response collectively.
Yeah, I wanted to point out that the occupancy rates in this option are in the range of 90% for Brewster, 85% for Memorial, 84% for Strong, and 79% for the high school. Okay, option C4. Great. Option C4, we are closing one building and reconfiguring another building into different grades than it currently holds. So this creates two elementary schools that are grades 1 through 5. Those two buildings are the Brewster and the Memorial School. The Memorial School has more classrooms than the Lyman School, so it made sense to try to use that for this purpose. The Early Childhood Center, which is pre-K and K in a single building, are located in the Corn School. That requires 7 classrooms. The Corn School has 8 classrooms. So there's actually one extra classroom in there for flexibility. That could be used for, possible growth in the future, some other program, or it could be have an extra teacher and fewer, smaller class sizes. As we go forward up into the upper grades, oh, by the way, the utilization number in the Corn School is 77%. In the Brewster School is 84, and Memorial School will be 82. These are without additions on those buildings. The Strong Middle School is once again a 3-grade middle school, grades 6, 7, and 8, and that's at an 84% utilization. And then the high school is 79%, just as it was before, grades 9 through 12. The order in which these would be done, we would first move the 6th grade to Strong, then we would split the 5th grade between the Brewster and Memorial, move the Lyman, grades 1 to 4, to Memorial, move Brewster, K and K, to the Corn, to reconfigure that as an early childhood center. The Lyman kindergarten would go to the Corn, and move all the Corn students to the Brewster, and close the Lyman School. The alternative here, which is the C4.1,
Well, I was going to offer one other note before we move on. Both C4 and C4.1 are alternatives that do reconfigure and identify an early childhood center. Although the program was not made part of this study, this is a utilization study, we were made aware of a NESDEC study that was performed a few years ago, which spoke to the integrated day and the contemporary day program. One of the recommendations that came forth out of that study was the idea that it may be beneficial for parents to have that opportunity to have their students in the system before making that decision as to which program would best suit their student. Both C4 and C4.1 are options that can accomplish this type of strategy.
because the transition happens after the kindergarten grade. And I just want to say C4.1 is fairly easy to describe because it's flipping the relationship between the Lyman and the Corn School. So in this case, the Early Childhood Center happens at the Lyman facility, and the Corn School is the one that gets closed. This one is slightly less efficient than the other one, but it does a couple of good things. One thing is that it allows Millfield to have 2 schools on it rather than 1. And it also gives the Corn School, which is in a good location here, possible future life that could serve the community better, being in a place that's kind of centrally located.
So that is an overview of the basically 3 family options that we felt were identified as most advantageous. You've all been patient in terms of questions, but we really welcome them and would love to have the chance to answer. Please feel free, questions relative to enrollments and demographics or the various options and alternatives that we have just shared with you. So we're open for those questions.
There's microphones available in the aisles.
I have 2 questions. How you backed off from doing anything about, saying anything about programs, which is fine, but then how do you get your utilization numbers in the C groups? You know, how are you saying that 82% of Brewster School will be filled up? Who are you filling it with? People from Durham or contemporary people?
We're using the enrollment projections that we got from Mylan and McGrew, and they did break them down by school. So we know how many students are in, are projected to be in each grade for each
So you're still using the programs as,
I'm still using proportions that are.
okay,
Yes.
okay. And the second thing is did you consider ever using the high school as the place to put pre-K?
Yes, we did have that. That was C5, I believe. It was one of the options on our chart. And we looked at that. The high school spaces that would be available would need substantial renovation to do that. We did look at it, and we felt that it was not as promising as we're using one of the other buildings that are closer to being elementary school type facilities.
I have 2 questions, if I could, please. I wasn't able to read all the considerations. I'm wondering if busing costs were one of your considerations as we shuffle kids around.
Busing as a standalone item, I do not believe was part of our matrix. However, it was part of the discussion as a working group looking at the various configurations. I'd say, generally speaking, busing was seen by the working group as an issue that would not necessarily drive the outcome in terms of selected solution.
My second question concerns your assumptions. I believe you had an assumption that home sales would be relatively flat. I'm wondering if I understood that correctly, how you could say that, considering and improving an economy and seniors aging out of their existing household being replaced by young families.
Not relatively flat. What we looked at was the last 2 years in the uptick and added a little onto that and assumed that that would be held steady going forward. But in this economic conditions, the way the housing market is, we thought that that provided the most realistic view going out over a course of 10 years with how much has changed over the last 10 years.
And seniors aging out of their house?
We've taken that into consideration also. We've looked at the population of those householders over 65 that own their own homes via the census data, and we're able to build that into our projection. But we don't have any indication on what their economic condition is and how much longer they're going to be in their homes based on the home values and when that rebound will occur. The housing conditions right now across the state and the nation are very difficult to predict going forward. What we try to use is a reasonable window, which we saw the uptick over the last 2 years and have progressed that forward without generating any assumptions on major changes in the market conditions.
Thank you.
Good evening. I was wondering, in your consideration of looking at building analysis, if you actually looked at both playgrounds and parking in your consideration. For example, one of your models, it doubles the population at Brewster School, and currently the parking doesn't meet the need that's there. People are parking on the playground to get to events. And then the other thing is, one of your models has pre-K and K going to Corn, but the playground there is not for that age group. And that would be a significant additional cost to the district to make that appropriate for the kids.
Yes. Relative to the question, the first component of it, were these types of facilities made part of the assessment as we looked at spaces? Yes. As we came and assessed the sites, we looked at condition of parking areas. We looked at availability and sizing of them. Certainly, as anybody seems to experience in facilities like this, there never seems to be enough when you do have major events. But in terms of recognizing suitability relative to day in, day out use, by all means, that's made part of the assessment. In terms of consideration of change of use, that is something that will have to be considered. And change of use, the example that you gave, if in fact Corn is made an early childhood center, would it have age-appropriate play structures, etc.? These are the types of things that would be definitely made part of the next portion of this study, and that's work to be done by the Board of Ed in terms of assessing what are all the significant contributors of cost or retrofit that are necessary to see a proposed approach come to fruition. So that's legwork that's still ahead. I would suggest that there is a certain amount of that type of work that will have to happen in reconfiguration of facilities. But certainly I would also suggest that if you look at it in the overall projected time frame and reuse of a building, it's relatively insignificant in terms of the overall overarching kind of time horizon, if you will.
Thank you.
Okay, as far as the program, the change of groupings of the grades, how will that affect the integrated day program? If you have like a 1 through 3, or it's no longer in even numbers, how does that work? Like it would be.
Yeah, because they use looping. You're talking about that.
No. 1s and 2s are together, 3s and 4s are together. How are you going to do that when there's not even number in the schools anymore?
Well, we were looking at the possibility of having, if I understand correctly, you're talking about which option, the one that is K.
So there were 2.
K
There was
3?
1 through 3 and 1 through 5.
Yeah.
Both of those are odd numbers.
Okay, but you include the kindergarten in there because you have K and 1.
Correct, but
2 and 3
currently
and 4 and 5.
kindergarten is not part of the integrated day program. It's not part of the combined grade program.
Yeah, please.
What we have now is multi-age, which means first and second graders are in the same class. Third and fourth graders are in the same class, and fifth and sixth. In some of the proposals, if you divide at 5 and 6, you're breaking up the classroom situation. If we break at 3 and 4, so it just takes apart the program because they are configured as third and fourth and fifth and sixth. So by splitting them, the integrity of that particular program is lost.
Yeah, but I would like to also say, as we go forward, there has to be a reconfiguration that has to do with Common Core. And I don't know if you've started dealing with this yet?
No, we're working that through that this, I'm telling you. students-
Okay, but there's a break between,
These programs.
yeah, there's a break between 5 and 6 in the Common Core testing. No, I'm saying this is still something that has to be resolved. It's really not part of what we were asked to do. for this study because it has to do with the program, and we're trying to do a utilization study.
Okay, then we do need to separate if we're saying that, I mean, because it was said that programming was considered in, and I do feel that that's a separation.
Okay.
I would also suggest that the question that's posed, the great pairing, is something that the board would have to take as a consideration. If they moved away from that pairing opportunity by having a standalone fifth grade in that circumstance that you identified, excuse me, the board would then also have to look at what are the advantages of a 3-grade middle school as compared to kind of a 2-grade structure as it stands. And there's advantage and disadvantage, I would suggest, on both sides of that discussion, but again, that's a board decision along with your input that would help drive that ultimately.
About putting the 6th through 8th graders together. Has there been thought about how the school would look? Because I really like to keep 6th graders away from those crazy subjects. And also the same thing, the other thing is with the busing, because I don't know if you guys are aware, but the junior high and the high school drive together on the bus. I don't know if that was thought about at all, because some 6th graders are like this and some 12th graders are like that. So I'm just wondering if that was at all talked about in this study.
Again, I would suggest issues relative to, is it age appropriate, for a 6th grader to be with an 8th grader in the school environment, or age appropriateness from a busing standpoint if the busing configuration remained the same. Is it age appropriate for a 6th grader to be in the same bus with a 12th grader? Those would be board decisions made in concert with you in raising those questions.
Hi there, good evening. That's really loud. As part of your study, again, I don't know if this goes to programming or just specific facility utilization, but one of the assets that I feel as a new member of this community is the fact that John Lyman is a hot school. And I was unclear when reading through the plans what would happen if the school closed or things got reconfigured, because it's such a rare and unique asset to this region, and I can't quantify it in numbers, but was that part of your study, and how is that affected if you know this answer?
Yeah, we're aware of the hot school designation and the opportunities that gives to the school system. When we talk about closing Lyman, we're not eliminating the program. We're moving it to actually a larger facility, and we're counting on the ability of the hot school program to continue if that is the will of the community. The other thing that we found is that if you wanted to spread the good news to other schools, hot school training is available to teachers even if the school itself is not designated as a hot school.
Right.
And so that's something that I think is a discussion that needs to continue.
But that would be a discussion with the Board of Education?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question about demographics. In your consideration of the demographics, is this decline that you're seeing you're predicting in our school district comparable to what other districts in the state are experiencing?
Yes, we're working with a number of other districts now that have really similar declines. The few that are not are the really urban centers that, as you can think of them, coastal urban cities that have been building a lot of higher density housing. Those are the only 2 districts I can think of. But yeah, between 20 and 30%. What's actually unusual here is it started a little earlier and we're seeing it bottoming out therefore a little sooner. So maybe ahead of the curve.
And then the decline at the high school rate, is that decline going to be more affected by the decline at the lower grades, or is it going to be, or is it more affected by the number of students who are leaving the district for private schools?
The number that are leaving for private schools is held steady, so it's compounded because of that, but you're still losing the same 50% or so every year, but because the number in 8th grade is lower, 15% is even smaller. But yeah, that's holding pretty steady.
Yeah, I'm not very good at my math, but this 20% decline that we're projecting across, how is that going to affect our class sizes? Are we going to, I mean, we're all paying taxes because we want smaller class sizes for all of our kids, whatever program we're part of.
It's completely understandable. I would say the one thing is you do get to a level that's not sustainable. You get reimbursements per student. And so there is certainly, you lose some students and you say, this is wonderful. We have slightly smaller class sizes for the same teacher and it's working really well. When does it get below that number when it's just not sustainable to keep that teacher? And unfortunately that is what we're discussing.
When do we reach that number? In 20 years?
I think that's really kind of what the gist of those larger studies about. It's also a local board decision when you get into it, talking about the utilization of the building as well as passing a budget every year in these tough times, and realizing that one of the key features here is the low class sizes to be able to maintain those in these economic times.
One other thing I want to say is when we were calculating the capacities of the buildings, we took into account the target class sizes that was approved by the Board of Ed. And we also take a utilization factor for the high school that is on top of that. We don't count 100% of the capacity, but rather 85% when you get to the high school level. That allows for scheduling and choices that the students make as they take some classes where they have much smaller number of students in the class, and that still allows that choice to happen with the 85% utilization factor at the high school level. So the high school, we count the classrooms, multiply by the number of seats, and then we take 85% of that and say that's the capacity, because you never want to have 100% of the rooms in the high school occupied. It just takes away choice for students that want to take an alternate course.
Hi. When you're calculating classrooms per building, are you considering classroom space for special such as OT, PT, speech and language?
No, I'm setting aside those kinds of functions so that they are included in the support spaces. So I've taken out music spaces, art spaces, phys ed, special ed, all these kinds of spaces, and at the middle school level they have tech ed spaces as well. And I'm saying that those are covered already. And then in the academic classrooms, those are the ones that contribute to the capacity of the school.
Also, by combining schools or putting more grades into one school, are you considering what the lunchroom or the all-purpose rooms might be, what they might look like, their time allotment, and the flexibility of a schedule?
Yeah, well, I want to react to that by reminding you that the amount when in most of these options where we're not adding to the building, we're actually putting the number of students in the building that are no greater than what they currently have. Okay, so you should be able, if you look at the support facilities in the building that are there now, such as the cafeteria size and the library size, if they adequately handle the current population, and you add a grade in the future, but you have fewer students in each grade, then you're still dealing with roughly the same population.
Yes, but does it also allow for teachers to have common planning periods and collaborate? Because we wouldn't put necessarily grade levels in the same lunch wave or grade levels in the same special. So we would need to have separate rooms, even though those classrooms are smaller, for students to have those special services.
It's a great question, and it is one that can be answered and solved in a variety of ways. I think what Paul is speaking to is, from a utilization study standpoint, we're not overloading the schools with students. The size of cafeteria, library, and other like support spaces are sized to handle these capacities. They should be able to work. They can work. I should say it more positively. They can work. They can work in a variety of ways, and those ways are outside the scope of this study. There's probably 4 or 5 options that I can think of in terms of how you might address cafeteria in terms of number of ways, or classes assigned to those ways, or how it may be administered. But the pure numbers side of it are solved as part of this study. The administration of it in terms of what's the highest and best use of that space, or how do we get the most effective use of that space, that's work that still has to be done. It's a great question, though.
Thank you.
First of all, I'd just like to say thank you for giving us this tool that will allow the community to be able to talk with the Board of Education as these things come up in the future. This is a great starting block, that we have something that we have common language that we can talk to each other back and forth about. I would also really like to thank you for bringing up class size. I think you could tell by the response in the auditorium that it is definitely something that got a round of applause and people really responded to. Now, in looking at what we have to talk and to use your presentation and all of your results, going ahead and talking with the Board of Ed, is there a way that you can convert? You have very specific numbers of enrollment, capacity, and then utilization percentages. Can you convert that into classroom sizes per grade for those, so that we have that going forward and talking with the Board of Ed in the future? I can look at that, I can look at the numbers and its capacity and percent utilization, but in my mind I can't figure out if that is 26, 27 students per class or 18 students per class, and that makes obviously a big difference to the people who are involved and who are here tonight. Is that something you could add?
We can, but what I would suggest is what it will reflect are the guidelines of the Board of Ed for capacities at grade level that currently exists. So it basically resets the calibration for each of the buildings. As Paul said, first setting aside all of the specials that are required as support space. Then we look at the numbers of interchangeable classrooms. The loading of those classrooms is guided by the current standing Board of Ed guidelines for that loading by grade.
Sure, but there are several different options that have different percentages of utilization, like option B, which would be closing some portables but not closing a school.
Yep.
I would like to see what that looks like for classroom size. With Common Core coming up, all studies have shown that after teacher training, classroom size is the #1 determining factor on the success of Common Core. So I think that is a vital number for us to have to proceed forward for all the options, because there is some difference between them.
We can do that calculation.
That'd be great. Thank you.
I just wanted to look as well. Can you pull up the matrix of options again? And in particular, I was a little concerned about the lack of transparency in how this matrix was created in the numbers and the relative scales. For instance, every particular category is scaled on a 1 to 5, and there's no individual weight towards educational or cost. For instance, you're weighting educational concerns and costs the same. In addition to that, I have no clue within, let's say, the category of cost, how you created that relative scale. So was it a $10,000 difference between the construction cost for building a whole new school versus keeping the school that we have? And if there was some way you could provide the data that you made to make this decision and create that table to the public, I think it would be extremely useful, because I can't make any decisions or talk to anybody about what we're seeing up here at this point.
Sure, and it's a great question. And it's one that I'd like to offer first. We're offering behind me just that, a tool. One that's used along with others and just pure common sense in terms of aegis options to bring forward for consideration by the board. And once again, we're not trying to drive this to a recommendation, a singular recommendation, but rather a range of reasonable options. To your question, are we talking tens of thousands? I'd say no, we're talking order of magnitude of tens of millions probably in terms of ranges. but we'll make that information as part of our report so that it can be seen in terms of what types of gradation was utilized. But it's very much a relative scale.
And then one more question. Moving forward, is DRA prohibited from any contracts with the board itself? And this just goes to the question of bias within the table creation.
Sure. Not to my knowledge. We haven't been made aware that we're not welcome for future contracts. It wasn't made part of the RFQ that was delivered initially. And it's, certainly this is work that we perform in many communities here within Connecticut.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Would you please clarify whether cost on that table represents predicted operating costs or whether it's the capital cost to realize?
Yes. Not operating costs, sir. We're talking about capital costs. We're talking about the actual cost relative to the facility. Operational costs are not part of this. But as was asked earlier, what about busing? What about staffing? Those are issues that will have to be delved into. They're not part of this utilization study. They absolutely should be part of the board's deliberation and thought process as they continue to think about these with the community.
Just a very quick high school question. Can someone share with me the current utilization figure for Cog and Chug?
Get there quickly, I
Sorry.
promise.
I have difficulty seeing your chart.
82%.
Oh, you beat me.
82%.
Because the quick question I had was that I'm aware of numerous teachers that travel the school on carts, which certainly has a high impact on the quality of the program that can be delivered. Was that taken into consideration when you considered utilization?
As I said before, our target, in other words, maximum for the high school, would be 85%. And right now you're at 82%, which tells me that it's very full. It's fully utilized currently. I'm not shooting for 100%. I'm shooting for 85%. And you can see right now it's very close to that number, which means you have fewer flexibilities.
I'd also like to point over my shoulder, and as we project forward to year 2016, 2017, and look at that percentage, it's 77. So it's heading in the direction that I think you want to see it head, which is increased flexibility and closer to a utilization rate that we strive for, when designing a building.
I recognize that you weren't asked to look at programming, but it's something that you considered. And it clearly says on the charts over there that programming would be available at the elementary grades, but it didn't say anything about the middle school, and your options have now the 6th through 8th middle school. Did you consider, because we currently have the integrated day program through 8th grade.
I'm aware of that. The middle school is probably one of the least flexible arrangements that we have, and it really is, for me, difficult to envision without spending more like design time how that would look in the middle school facility. I think because I know that there's 2 teams at 3 different grades. And I know there's not 6 clusters of classrooms there, that we would have to look at that in more detail to actually figure out how it would happen. There is enough capacity there to be able to do it, but I don't know exactly how that would look like yet.
Thank you. The numbers that were indicated under the C146 and C448 and C4147, I guess were just high tallies in comparison to the new building replacement as 50. And yet the C4.1 I don't think is practical. Just my assumption from your dialogue this evening. The safety stressed as 5 across the board was impressive because we do consider safety number one for our children. And furthermore, with costs not having been divulged, looking forward to seeing what savings we might attain down the road. But may I ask, from other districts on towns that you have worked with, might there be a percentage that is kind of relatively the median for accomplishing this in any one school or schools that, you know, do they say like overall to help out the budgets, maybe 18% or something of what the cost would have been otherwise?
If I'm understanding the question, you're asking in other communities where we've served, do we find a normative overall savings to community? And simply stated, no. Each community that we serve is a very unique circumstance. The drivers run the gambit. Everything from, even in these times of declining enrollment, overcrowding in a particular portion of their system that needs to be addressed, or issues of racial or economic imbalance within the district that's driving the community to look at other configuration options. So, you know, each community has its issue and concern. As Michael and Ally touched on, the driver consistently here in Connecticut over the last, I'd say, 4 to 5 years has been declining enrollments. But I honestly, even with that as a common given, I can't say that there's an overarching commonality amongst the various projects that we've served on.
Well, thank you for that, because it was just reported a day or two ago in our local paper, Middletown Press, having covered the business of school tuition costs having gone up so much just in the last decade that it can be more affordable to send your child to a private school. And I find that kind of abominable when a public education to be offered for all, and having been an amendment to our Constitution to accomplish that, and that the monies that are needed seem to have skyrocketed so that no one seems to be on the same footing any longer because of the economy. And I also understand that it seems that this projection would be more or less realized for the 2016 to 2017 school year, I assume. Yet we are talking, we're in the budget process now for the upcoming year. Would it be feasible with your input to have this realized for 2015 to 2016 school year?
Well, let me be clear first. In terms of the identification of school year 2016, 2017, that was utilized as a point of reference in a series of slides. I was trying to capture a single school year started, as Paul touched on. The likelihood of implementation of any option or alternative that includes change is likely not one that can be implemented in short order, such as next school year. The selection of that particular school year by the team was simply trying to identify a target date where the lion's share of all the options studied could reasonably be accommodated at that school year, that point in time. As Michael and Ally indicated, your enrollments continue to decline. And as we showed in the first slide, if you compare utilization as it stands, looking at today's numbers, and we look ahead 10 years or 8 years, it continues to decline, and that availability of space becomes more prevalent in the system. So I simply wanted to say the utilization of the date was meant to be a point of reference such that we can compare and contrast these various options across a common kind of horizon.
Thank you, appreciate that.
You're welcome.
I was just wondering if there's a slide to show us what it looks like to remove the portables to address decrease in population as opposed to closing schools or reconfiguring the system.
Currently, there are only 2 portables that are being used for classrooms. The other portables that are at the various schools are being used for office functions and storage and meeting rooms. And the portables that at Lyman School, they have 2 portables that currently have classrooms in them. And we're saying that the portables or modular classrooms have a limited lifetime, and we shouldn't count on them as permanent space, even though they do last for years. But they wear out and they become less usable as they go. So we didn't want to count on that as permanent space. So we go forward. Only 2 classrooms are affected by that. The rest of the classrooms are being held inside the built space of the buildings.
So your future projections do not have the portables in them?
They don't have the portables used as classrooms.
Okay. I am a little concerned because you're drawing data from a 5-year span that was directly affected by the recession. And what I'm wondering is how this study is any better than the one done several years back, which resulted in the closure of the school in Middlefield, and then proved mistaken in its projections and necessitated the use of portables.
I think as we showed on one of our slides, the larger downturn in births isn't a localized event, nor is it a small point in time. I think what we're seeing from the enrollment decline, especially when we looked at the national birth trends, is something that has been started well before that we hit this economic downturn. What we're seeing is that it's just been compounded by it. The same question is asked in many communities that we work in is, what is a normal economy? Was it the boom that we saw in the 2000s, or is it, where we're at right now, or is it something in between? And I think the last answer is probably, the most realistic one. But what I can tell you is when we began testing these numbers, and I know Paul's methodology for it is that it's a very conservative approach in taking our projections and aligning it with the facility capacity and utilizing an 85% utilization. Looking at our projections over the course of 10 years, the first 5 years are very accurate. Those are many knowns, especially for the elementary, middle, and high school. It's the last 5 years. We can see that the decline started well before the recession here, as was experienced in many communities and throughout Connecticut from our larger data set. So I think when you're referencing the situation that occurred in the past, we're in much different times now from that.
So what is your confidence interval then for not the next 5 years, but the 5 years after that? What's your confidence interval?
I would say that you're looking at probably, for the elementary projections, if those assumptions hold true, you would have a very strong confidence in the data. If we fall into another recession or if we get a very quick rebound, I would recommend the district to reevaluate and rerun the enrollment projections. You guys know your community best. You see housing sales pick up. You see a lot of new construction starting. Now is the time to begin looking at the numbers again, seeing if the kindergarten enrollments are changing, see if any factors are changing. As it stands right now, I feel very confident in those numbers moving forward, being a strong indication of what's most likely to occur.
But you don't have a number for confidence.
An exact confidence interval, I haven't done the calculation for that. It's something that we could get. But looking at the numbers, we ran 5 different enrollment projection models, looking at everything from the economic conditions being what they are today moving forward 10 years, looking at the recession in the 2008-2010 window when it was at its worst, and also looking at the economic conditions when they were at its best. And I can tell you, looking at those, the range of enrollment projections that we had over 10 years didn't deviate by a heck of a lot. They were all within about 6 or 7% of each other. When we're talking about the consolidation of a building or reconfiguration, they are not going to be a major factor in that determination. This is a long-term event. It's going to take a while to be able to dig out of that decline in enrollment. And I think what we're going to see is, if anything, we're going to look at the elementary enrollments flat and begin to see a rebound. Even in the best of economic times, housing sales are booming again. It's a slow process of building the enrollment back. I hear the same thing in many different communities. We shouldn't have closed the school, 30 years ago, but for those 29 years in between, you really had no use for the building. I think it comes down to the community's will of being able to sustain, fund, and budget for an additional building.
I think that in order not to make the same mistake twice, it would be very helpful if we could have those statistics.
I would be glad to provide the range of projections.
And I'd like to bring up this chart again, because I think, as I said earlier, that it did start a little earlier. One thing that's not going to happen in the next 10 years or the next 15 years are we going to get these class sizes here again. Even if we're wrong by 20%, we're looking at flattening out about 120. And as you can see here, that's 1,400 students. The declines are here. These cohorts here in yellow are not coming back through the system in the next 15 years. And so even if we're looking at these going through and replacing them with about 120, it's a really different situation of what Mike said earlier, a new normal of enrollment.
If I can just offer one additional point to this, and I think it's a very important one. Michael suggested this is a tool, and it's a tool that stands with a high level of confidence today. But as time goes forward, we strongly recommend that this is something that the district continually keep its eye on. As Michael said, you know your community better than any, and we respect that. And by all means, that should be something that if an uptick is seen, if a significant change is seen, it should be responded to. And it can be responded to with study information 5 years down the road, 4 years down the road, that would afford a recheck of this information, any confirmation of it or an adjustment to it. But the numbers that sit here are consistent with numbers that we see in other communities, and that is a real shift in terms of what are the numbers that we're seeing as part of systems. And this decline in order of magnitude of 20% range is common.
I have a question about the grade reconfigurations and just the way that in all of the options, or all of the C options, you're ending up with an odd number that doesn't follow our current integrated day program in terms of where the breaks happen. If you wait a few more years to implement this, is it possible to get a 5 through 8 middle school, or is there something magic about having a 6 through 8 middle school? Because it seems if you had a 5 through 8 school, you would end up with something that would be more workable for what we already have.
Yeah, that's a good point. If you continue to consider implementing this different years as you go forward, you probably would find a point at which you're able to fit one more grade into the existing shell. In other words, the number of classrooms that are available. I didn't do that study, but that's an interesting option because it means that you have to wait a little bit longer before you tackle the problem. But yeah, I should think you'd be able to look at a time and see when that would be feasible.
And with the information that you provide, I mean, is that something that anybody looking at the study could figure out, or?
Yeah, the numbers are there, but I think I could do a quick takeoff on that and find out when that happens.
I think it would be interesting to know, just because I certainly, I just foresee a lot of problems given the way the integrated day program currently works. And it might be more palatable to people, or maybe not. But.
Okay, so the grade configuration you wanted to look for is?
Well, yeah, 5 through 8.
K to 5?
No.
K to 4?
K to 4, or like a 1 to 4.
K to 4 or K to 6?
No.
Keep 5 and 6 together.
I'm looking for some way to keep 5 and 6 together, and
So
I
you
guess
still
I
have
wouldn't
a
really mind
2-grade
how
middle
you
school?
did it.
You still have a 2-grade middle school?
No, I'm talking about maybe a 4-grade middle school. Is that possible?
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I missed the first 15 minutes, but I'm pretty confused. And maybe it's that, like, I just see so many options out here. And I do a lot of work in strategic planning, and usually you kind of try to condense it or get it to where you can start to make some decisions. So I guess my first question, and maybe this was covered in the first 15 minutes, is what is the actual purpose? Is our purpose to save money? Is our purpose to try to make all of us happy? Or is that not part of the building utilization?
I believe it's the latter. I believe the purpose of this study was to respond to the declining enrollments that are evident and be able to identify a utilization study of the existing facilities to see if there are other options and alternatives available to the community.
Okay, so now put on the matrix that we have where you put on the 1, 3, and 5. And I know somebody asked for the detail, and I would probably, that would be interesting to me as well. But when you're looking at that, because we have in this cost as well as educational piece of it, I can't imagine what the numbers on the bottom really are. What are those numbers trying to tell us, the totals? Can we describe that again just for me? Once again, I apologize because you probably
No problem. We're happy to help. Cold out there tonight.
It's raining, so I think it's going to go away, so if I can hang out there with me a little bit.
We utilize this matrix as a tool. It is not an end-all. It is not meant to be a holy grail of any sort.
Well, I guess where I'm going, let me just try to...
Let me answer your question.
Okay.
You had a question which is, what does the bottom line number tell us? And it's an ability for us to look at individual considerations, and if we run horizontally across the table, we could look at that consideration as it's compared to each of the various options considered. What we can do vertically is understand how does that option compare to others as you look at all of them taken together. That's all it does. And it's an opportunity to use it as a relative scale. So it's a tool. And it's one that affords an opportunity to take a wide variety of options or considerations and compare and contrast them and understand how does an individual option perform relative to that. And then again, as I said, taking it vertically, how does it act as a whole consideration? That's the only purpose of it.
Okay. So, because I caution, and maybe this is going now to the Board of Ed, I caution utilizing these numbers just because when I'm looking at it, and I'm quite naive in this, but I would have to think program transition, or I can't really read what it is, and the one that is least disruptive to me would be doing nothing, and yet that has a 1, which means that it's, so if we were to just keep everything the way it was, I would have to think that that would be the least disruptive to the way the programs are operating right now. And then if I put on my financial hat and we look at the busing piece, which you noted that you didn't take into consideration, but doing nothing, it stays 3 right across, yet I would have to think if we got rid of a couple of buildings and we did less busing, there would be some kind of change. So I guess I got too caught up in the numbers, and maybe they are meaningless, but I caution, once again, I guess that's going to the board, that I caution that they don't get too caught up in all that.
And we would share your cautionary statement, and we will share the same with the board. Please don't get caught up in the numbers. Let's talk the issues. I would say minus utilization of such a tool, we would land on the same recommendations that we brought forth this evening, and I believe in the period that you had an opportunity to view. I would say that very strongly, that take the matrix away, take the part that you missed in the presentation away, and look at the considerations that are offered as highest recommendations to the board. I think there's a lot of merit in them that we can talk about in other terms, other than a matrix.
So then, once again, we're back to, is it to try to please all of us, or is it to try to reduce the cost for the district? Because I think a lot of that, I think they're going to be conflicting at some point, and that's, obviously going to be a problem.
And my job is not to please everybody, and my job isn't necessarily to answer all questions. It's simply the base curiosity of the board was, in this time of enrollment decline, how do we respond? What are the options? Because it's a time of real opportunity for Regional School District 13. It's a time for real opportunity to potentially reduce cost, I'll use that word, but at the same time, get better educational programs as an outcome of that. Those are the opportunities that are there. And I think those are really valid concerns and valid points of interest for any district to be thinking about in a proactive way. And I believe that's what this study effort that was proposed by the board is meant to be. It's a proactive response to an issue that's affecting the entirety of the state that has been reported by Ally and Michael. Some districts are caught in a reactionary stance, and it's not a comfortable one. School closures happen as a reaction to things rather than proactively planned for. So our purpose in this is to afford the district enough information to understand what are the physical conditions of the building, what's an assessment of the educational work that's ongoing within them today, and we've done that through programming sessions in each of the buildings, and also consider what are some options and alternatives in thinking about it other. But certainly the idea of staying as it is today, that's certainly a consideration as well, because that gives us something to compare and contrast those against.
Well, thank you. And I do appreciate the board extending it out to all of us. That's because it does get our ideas out there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I've got some questions about a 6, 7, 8 configuration. My question begins with what percentage of utilization is considered best practices for a middle school building? And what is the current percentage of utilization at Strong? Because currently we have 330 students approximately there, and the 6, 7, 8 projection looks to increase that to 410. So that seems to me like rather a large increase.
The current utilization factor at Strong is 63%, and that was one of your questions. And they have, let's see.
And what is best practices for middle school?
Once again, I think you should strive for around 85%.
Okay, because the building doesn't seem to me to be 63% occupied right now.
It seems what?
The building, as it stands now, does not feel only 63% occupied.
It feels more crowded than that?
Yes. So bringing it to 410 students, increasing the population by 90, brings us up to what utilization?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
If we bring up the student population to 410, as your projections show, what percentage of utilization are we at then?
Let me look. Looks like 84%.
Which number for? What? Which number? Which option number?
That would be all of the C's.
Yeah, they're all doing the same thing.
Okay.
It's 84% for the Strong.
All right, thank you.
I was wondering why programs were not included if it's such a large concern for the whole community. I mean, that's
because programs are not really a function of how we use our buildings, how we decide to educate our children is really a group decision that needs to be driven by our community and by our administration. So by understanding what facilities we have available, that's one complete issue. But I think we're going to talk a little bit after DRA finishes up about our need to develop a common vision for our educational future. And until we do that, we can't make a decision, and the board recognizes that's really the most important and most challenging aspect of what the board's dealing with here. And certainly bringing consultants in that have no experience in our community, as much as I respect their expertise, they cannot solve that problem for us. That is something that we're going to have to work out as a community. And it just was, I mean, I don't care who you hire or how much experience they have to come in and really deal with the complexity of all the questions that have been asked of us so far. I don't believe you could find a consultant that you would believe even if they were able to do it, because they don't know us. So the board recognized that and said, and we'll talk about that a little bit later when we finish talking about the utilization of physical space.
Good evening, and thank you for your time. Because I know how long it takes to sometimes make decisions as a community, I'm interested to know what your estimate is on the shelf life of this study. So I understand that the first 5 years of data is pretty active, and then we lose a little bit of confidence in the latter part. But what if we find that in year 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, we're trending just as predicted? Is it safe to say that we can use this study past that 10-year period, or will it have to be substantially updated at that point if we haven't yet reached a conclusion on how we're going to utilize our building?
Thank you. It's a great question, and it was one that was actually asked as part of the interview during the selection process, and that was shelf life. You know, when we look at studies like these, the projection horizon that was identified as part of the RFQ was 10 to 15-year time frame. There was full recognition, as was offered by Mylone and McBroom, relative to enrollment projections, that looking forward, that 5-year window, very high confidence level, and because those students that ultimately will fill those seats aren't born or identified as of yet, the confidence level trails off as you move forward. I'd say similarly, as you look at the work that we provide relative to the utilization study, it trends similarly. It's solid for the 10-year window. However, through the first 5 years, I'd say that 3 to 5 year window, it's fresh. It's information that can be referred to as recent. It can be referred to as something that was recently looked into. Conditions that were observed relative to the building envelope, the mechanical systems, etc., still a high level value. As you get out to that 6 to 10 year range, I would only suggest it's still a useful tool, but if you're about to enter into a major investment in terms of a direction taken, there should be a subset study done at that point, which is to say, what are the specific levels of detail that are necessary to ensure that we're making the right decision. I think that is very much a necessity as you move forward.
One last question. Did the utilization study take into consideration the utilization of the buildings after school hours as well?
Not directly. We do consider the need for community type spaces as we develop the different options. But we didn't measure the utilization of the existing spaces, in other words, how heavily they're used after school hours as such.
Good evening. Thank you for all this information. It's been very helpful for myself. I have a few questions / comments about the matrix, just looking over my notes. First and foremost, you're architects, engineers, building specialists, correct? You're not education specialists. Are you, any of you educators?
I'm sort of, I have a foot in each camp. I've been designing schools for over 30 years. What is it, 35 now, I think? 35. And enjoying every minute of it. I also, in doing this work, get to talk with a lot of educators. And they're constantly asking about, first of all, what's going on in other schools, and secondly, what's happening next. So we have to keep up with that sort of thing. I also teach 2 nights a week at the Boston Architectural College, so I've seen it from the other side as well.
The only reason for asking is one of the 4 quadrants in your matrix is educational results. And to me, educational results are measured by student performance, by empirical data, by qualitative analysis. I don't take it that type of consideration as part of what you were presenting to the board.
No, we don't test students directly.
Well, not testing students, but examining. Certainly, there's many ways to measure performance over a period of time. Obviously, that's an important consideration, I think, that would go into any evaluation or criteria scoring of educational results. So I just wanted to clarify that you weren't purporting to offer any expertise in that regard. You're talking about structures and using rooms and buildings.
Yes.
My other question.
If I may, just to stay with that question, we're offering opinion and results relative to facilities, as you suggest, but specifically educational facilities. 95% of everything that goes out of our door has to do with education, whether it's early childhood education, public school education, private school education, corporate training facilities, college and university. It is what our firm focuses on. Levels of expertise with individuals within the firm is a good example. To my left, somebody who's been with the firm for 35 years, focused on educational planning and programming. So I just want to clarify,
and I appreciate
not
that.
simply
I'm just
facilities. We don't talk warehouses, we don't talk courthouses or jailhouses. I'm talking about educational facilities.
But for purposes of my own edification of what is being presented, as well as for everyone in our towns, student performance is not a component of what you were presenting.
That is correct.
And also, as to the other quadrant regarding costs, everything I've heard and read measures costs in dollars, if I understand it. That's what you're putting here. And I think this is more just an observation looking forward as to where the departing point of what you hand over to the Board of Ed and where our community goes forward. I measure costs in things other than dollars. For the interests of our children, for our community, there are costs which cannot be measured in dollars. The quality of an education, the culture of a school, and the impact on our property taxes. It's a financial cost, but it's not a traditional one of closing a school, potentially losing a hot program. And so those type of measurements also aren't part of what you're putting forth, because that really wasn't your mandate. But I do think those are the type of considerations when we talk costs and when it's part of a diagram presented as to evaluation. I think there's a lot of
And we would wholeheartedly agree with you. The information that is being provided, we feel is a useful tool. It's a point of departure for a long conversation that has to happen here within your community. And those other factors that you point to, for many in the community, resonate. And certainly will resonate with the Board of Ed as they're brought to them. So by all means, I'd say keep the conversation going forward.
Okay, well, thank you, Jim and Ally and Mike and Paul. Really appreciate that. Obviously, I'm sure everybody is saying, so what's next? And I think what we saw tonight is pretty indisputable that we are experiencing and will continue to experience, without doubt, at least over the next 5-year period, and very likely at least 5 years beyond that, a significant decline in enrollment. Obviously have prepared notes, but I feel compelled to talk about a couple of things or questions that came out tonight. One in particular was this grid or matrix that Jim presented and we've spent some time talking about. And I would tell you that from a board standpoint, what we see in looking at that is what options are we more likely to want to spend time to evaluate further than others. In other words, we're not going to spend a lot of time trying to get architects and construction and cost estimates and design plans to reconstruct every building in the district, right? So relatively speaking, although there are some advantages to doing that, it's not very likely that we would pursue it. And you can see that, we can see that by looking at that chart. It was not intended in any way to estimate costs or to tell us what the answers are. It was really a way for us to prioritize which kind of options would we be likely to want to spend more time investigating further. And that's probably what we're going to do when we talk about next steps. I also want to emphasize that the board recognizes the importance of directing every possible dollar of our education budget to resources that are spent on actually educating our children rather than allocated to the operation, maintenance, and overhead inherent in using or in maintaining underutilized buildings. That's really what this is about. It's very clear we're going to have underutilized buildings, and I'm much more willing to try to be proactive about that, as Jim said, and get ahead of it, than wait until we are just backed up against a wall and getting into the month of July and announcing that we have to close a building in September, because that has very negative impacts on our students and on our community. We need to plan together for this. This is reality, folks. We have to figure out what to do about it, and it's not an easy question. It's a very difficult process, and as I listened to all your questions tonight, I was like, okay, that's another thing we have to consider. And we can't consider all of these options for all of these considerations for all 9 of those options. So we have to start somewhere, and we'll look at an option, get more details about it, and either decide this isn't going to work and we have to go to something else. We may end up coming up with some version or combination, as somebody said tonight, maybe we should combine strong to be 5 through 8, not 6 through 8. And these are the kinds of things and questions that the board has to do next. This is a very difficult process, and it's very complicated, and it's going to take a lot of time. Let's see if I can maybe I can get some help to get back to your slide, Pat. Okay, I just want to be really quick, turn to the next. Okay, that's fine. Yep. So, what are our next steps? Perhaps the most challenging work to be done centers on developing a clear understanding of our future educational needs by working with our school administrators and our community to form a common vision for the future. And with that in mind, I'd like to introduce Dr. Catherine Veronese to share some of her insights on future educational goals.
The answer to the question that you're all thinking about is yes. the heat is on. Really, we tried to look at this, and we did work on the heat, and I apologize. But it's making me think that perhaps you're just cold and not angry, and that's why your hands are folded over your chest. I appreciate that I have a few moments to talk tonight, and I do realize that we're beyond the published ending time. And I happen to be very fond of John Dewey's quote, "Education is not preparation for life, education is life itself." And John Dewey was an educational reformer, a philosopher, and a psychologist. And the reason that this quote is one that has always been important to me is that I think it really underscores the fact that every moment for every child is what's important right now. And our job as public school educators is also that preparation. And that duality exists, and I think that that's what makes our work so important. And Danya, when you talk about the Constitution, public schools are part of the heartbeat of a democracy. And everything we do helps to strengthen and sustain that. So when I make a commitment to you that we will examine what is the very best for the children in District 13, it's a really big commitment. Because these children are not just children of Durham and Middlefield. They're children of this country, and they're children of the world. And so, I haven't been here 2 months yet. But what I have heard in these conversations is a tremendous concern and fear about losing programming and losing choice that is a part of this community. I hear that. And what I heard tonight was, through your applause, not just that class size matters, but your child's relationship with their teacher and their experience in our schools is really important to you. And so, one of the assignments I had when I interviewed here was, for any of you who have interviewed recently, a performance task. And the board asked me what process I would use to increase the overall performance of all students here. And I came up with a really cool plan that was going to take about 2 months. I forgot that I was also going to be working, like passing a budget and calling snow days. But the process that I suggested, before even knowing that this was going to be a part of what I would be doing, was something called connected conversations. And what I suggested to the board, and what I would suggest to you, is that as we proceed with this process, we start by talking. I need to hear from you. And so, if you didn't have to go home tonight, I would get snacks and chart paper and marker, and you would start talking about this. What is important? What do we believe in? Because that's where it starts. And again, I haven't been here 2 months yet, but I think it's work that we need to do. Whether or not our enrollment was declining, we need to look at what we believe in here. And I know that you've all seen our mission. I just want to read it because I like it. And I started highlighting the important words, and I realized I highlighted the entire mission. The mission of Regional School District 13, a community that embraces learning, honors tradition, and embraces change, is to ensure that all students will be engaged and ethical, lifelong learners and citizens who will thrive, excel, and contribute to an ever-changing, interdependent world by providing challenging, diverse, and nurturing experiences that empower each student to succeed through meaningful partnership with family and community. Embraces change. I'm not sure that change is always embraced. We might not use the word embrace to characterize the process that we'll use, but we are going to have to change. It's our commitment, I believe, to the children of this community to be aware of what their experience is every single day, and to be absolutely committed to making sure that we deliver on the mission, because this is our promise to these children. Our first step is those kinds of conversations. And I think that I'm going to do an awful lot of listening. And that is the first next step. Have we made decisions about programming? Absolutely not. We have made no decisions. That wasn't the purview of this first step. But I have been handed a baton for the next leg of this relay. And when I talk to other superintendents who say, "So Kath, how's it going?" "Oh, I'm running to a utilization meeting. They're talking about possibly closing a school." And they say, "Oh dear God." Well, I'm in good company. I'm in good company with superintendents across the Northeast and throughout Connecticut. I don't see it as daunting. I see it as an opportunity. I think that the kids in this community will continue to have a bright future, perhaps brighter, and then the work for us collectively is going to be exciting and courageous, but probably not easy. And I'm looking forward to it, and I think by virtue of the fact that you are here tonight, you are proving to me one of the very things that I said before I threw my hat in the ring for this job, and that is that community has a heartbeat. So this is my next step. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. So if that wasn't daunting enough for you to think about, what this really means, and again, not just what does declining enrollment mean to our communities and to our schools, but what does what's happening in education across the nation and across the world mean to our schools, which is a question that we'll be looking to Kathy and to our administrators to help us guide a conversation through. In addition to that, there's a lot of other considerations, and many of you raised a lot of these questions this evening. Maintenance, construction, and operating costs related to each building. As DRA said, they have conducted, with the help of architects and engineers, a complete review of every building. And our buildings have a lot of different age. They were built at different points in time. There have been many projects related to capital improvements in different buildings at different times. And all of that needs to be really carefully reviewed to understand what are our future capital and maintenance costs with each building. Because if you're talking about taking a particular building out, not only is it a question of what would we be saving if we didn't if we closed that building, it's a question of saying how much additional maintenance and capital are we going to put into that building in the meantime, and what's the life of that investment. So maintenance, construction, and operating costs, though not quite as exciting as talking about education, has to be carefully looked at. We do have to evaluate potential state reimbursements to the extent that the state has participated in funding for any capital improvements for our buildings, like the roofs and the wells that we just did at, where did we do those at? Brewster, Memorial, and Lyman. Was that it? I can't even, I hate it. Getting old really is awful. I can't remember these things. At any rate, those investments from the state have to be maintained for a period of years. They amortize the money that they've contributed to us over a period of time. And if we put that building out of use as a school in less amount of time than they designate, we have to refund the difference. So there's those invisible costs that you might not think of, but those have to be evaluated for every building, for every capital improvement for which the state has reimbursed us. We also have to look at alternative use of buildings. There's a lot of potential issues. I mean, how are we going to use it? How does it help the community? How does one building compare to the other in terms of its usefulness to the community, in terms of its ability to meet early childhood care centers? Is it something that we can use for a STEM to continue to develop and expand our STEM program, which we all know is another important educational program that's on the horizon, but really evaluating alternative costs for each building is a big deal, and different buildings have different alternative uses. So that's going to take some time. We also have to evaluate potential savings in other operating areas and overhead expenditures. And yes, we have to look at transportation impacts. And those impacts are different depending on what the configuration of buildings that we're looking at. And we also, yes, have to look at variability or the delta in each of the demographic projections. I want to point out that the board has already committed that, and by the way, this is also recommended by the state, that we update demographics regularly. And I believe that we're pretty committed to at least, hopefully every 2 years, at most probably every 3 years, because we, again, want to stay proactive, not reactive to what's happening in terms of demographics. So we are committed to keep an eye on that and watch what's happening over time and how that influences our decisions. I think we have to watch. I don't think we're going to see any. We don't want to be surprised by a variation. We don't want to close our eyes and not look again for 8 years and then find out, oh, the birth rate's way up and now we have 4 years to react. So we'll be staying current on demographic projections. I think what this all means is that it's an evolving process. As we continue our conversations and explore these additional considerations, new ideas and opportunities and issues will likely arise. We will continue as a board to delve into all of these matters throughout the spring and summer and hope to be able to report back to you on our progress by next fall. We'll also continue to provide updates and share information as we evaluate different options. On behalf of the board, I want to thank DRA and our administrative team for their hard work to this point. DRA's expertise and objectivity has informed us and has facilitated the exchange of ideas and opinions, which will help to guide the board as we continue with this study. I extend a special thanks to you and all of the members of the community who have participated in the workshops, sent letters, come to board meetings, and provided feedback in this process. This is exactly what we have to do to solve this difficult and uncomfortable problem. So thank you for your participation, and I really appreciate you coming out on this kind of gloomy, cold night. Thank you very much.